Hello, welcome all to this webinar um, of the Research Integrity Network. And today we have NRIN Happy to speak about responsible supervision. We'll use about half of the time for her speech. And then afterwards, Mariette van den Hoven will be the referee and start a discussion, after which you can pose your questions. So, Tamarina, can you share your screen? The floor is yours.
Thank you. Just want to verify that you can see it. Excellent. Thank you. Thanks, Jenny, and thanks to Rita and Mariette for inviting me. So today I want to talk about responsible supervision, considering the perspective from both the PhD candidates and the supervisors. When I embarked on this project, there was already a couple of things that were known about responsible supervision. There's no consensus definition, but if you compare different reviews that have been done in different studies, we can normally identify three components rather consistently. The first being that the supervisor is supposed to be a role model. So that means the supervisor engages in responsible research practices themselves. Second is the idea that the supervisor encourages the PhD candidate to engage in responsible research practices. After all, it could be that the supervisor has more of a coordinating role or is perhaps first in another subdiscipline than the PhD candidate, but they could nevertheless invite the PhD candidate to, for example, invest more time into identifying the relevant data repository for their type of research. And finally, and this one's very close to my heart, there's the idea that the supervisor is able to create a psychologically safe climate. And with that, I mean a supervisory climate where a PhD candidate dares to ask questions, admit mistakes, and also challenge the status quo. And research in this area is growing, but some knowledge gaps remain. A recent scoping review by colleagues from KU Leuven identified a total of 35 studies on the topic, 2/3 of which used survey design, and most of them inquired perceptions from either PhD candidates or from supervisors. And what also struck me is that there was no empirical evidence on this idea that the supervisor is a role model, and there were no validated measurement instruments. But I want to draw your attention in this talk particular to the middle one, because I think we all know of situations where supervision maybe didn't go as smoothly as we wished for, because there was a mismatch in expectations, because we weren't able to bring together these two perspectives. So that's what I wanted to do with this study. And in particular, I asked two interrelated questions, namely, what sort of practice and procedures could supervisors engage in to promote responsible conduct of research among their PhD candidates? And which kind of actions or behaviors could promote a supervisor relationship that's characterized by psychological safety and organizational trust? And to answer these research questions, I used focus groups. Focus groups are group interviews where, in our case, a group of researchers with some shared characteristic, being either a supervisor or a PhD candidate, deliberated over a topic where they all have some experience with, under the guidance of a moderator, which was me in this case. And it's known from previous research that there are differences between different disciplinary fields and how they think about good research. So I organized these focus groups distinguishing 5 different disciplinary fields: the biomedical sciences, social behavioral sciences, the humanities, the natural sciences, and also the technical sciences. And I conducted these focus groups separately for PhD candidates and for supervisors. And that may sound a little bit odd in a study that wants to bring perspectives together, but I also wanted to ensure that people felt safe to speak about both experiences that were really good, but also maybe experiences that happened to them that gave them more ways to think about what could be good, because their experience may not have been very good. And for that, I wanted to assure that they were in a community among peers that they felt confident around. I did use the same moderator guide, so both supervisors and PhD candidates deliberated over similar topics. And in the analyses, as you will see, I deliberately tried to integrate their perspectives using inductive content analysis. I sampled purposively, and it's also known actually from other fields of research that even within a discipline, we're not all doing the same thing. So, for example, within the social behavioral sciences, qualitative and quantitative researchers may think very differently about what good research looks like. So that's why I made a distinction there, and I organized a separate focus group, for example, here for qualitative social science researchers. And I ended up talking to a total of 85 researchers. Now, I want to walk you through my main results, starting with the first research question. So remember that one was about the sort of practice or procedures supervisors can engage in to promote responsible conduct of research. And I'll illustrate those using a heat map. And the heat map is based on the fact that you will see that for every theme I identified, I give a little heat map indication of how prevalent and important a theme was considered by this particular disciplinary field. So I will focus sometimes on themes that were only relevant for some disciplinary fields, but the majority you will see was actually relevant according to all, although the precise practices took a slightly different shape. We start with clear relevance. So this meant for supervisors that they would question the PhD candidate about the relevance of their work to get the PhD candidate really to critically reflect on what am I really contributing with these 4 years of my life, or maybe even more. And supervisors also try to get the PhD candidates to understand the relevance of their work by helping them situate their work within the broader trends of the field. So sometimes this could include pointing them to sources that they may have been missing or showing an even greater breadth of work that had been conducted. And supervisors also demonstrated valuing relevance by staying up to date with the field and sharing exciting papers with their group or things that they thought were interesting novel developments. And at the same time, they tried to question the relevance of a source within discussions with their PhD candidates and really tried to get them to think of how does my research fit into the other things that are conducted or investigated within the group. And I think this is nicely shown in this quote from a supervisor of the social sciences who's actually recounting her own experience, where she was asked at the start of a project by her supervisor, why should the government have given you this much money? And she thought it was quite a big question, but she has incorporated this practice also in challenging her PhD candidates from time to time. And she now integrates it consistently and always asks at the beginning or at the end of a paper or project, why should I care about this? Why should society care about this? And really try to get their PhD candidates to come up with a clear and understandable answer. Researchers from across different disciplinary fields cared about transparency. And here you can see that particular emphasis was placed on these kind of practices among researchers from the biomedical, natural, and the social behavioral sciences. So supervisors tried to practice this by being open about their affiliations and interests, and also discussing cases where there could be a potential conflict of interest with their research group. They also focused on encouraging thorough and detailed reporting, which could include pointing to relevant reporting guidelines or maybe sharing examples. And it also meant that they really tried to encourage their PhD candidates to write in a way so that readers would understand how they arrived at their particular conclusions. So this really meant focusing on clarity and also avoiding unnecessary jargon, which is something that PhD candidates at times, maybe through their master thesis, have implicitly taken up, that it would indicate good research. So this is a nice illustration from a PhD candidate in the social sciences who's actually doing qualitative research and who's talking about her supervisor always encouraging her to use human words. So she really wants to see a clear plan going from A to B. What are you doing? And can readers really follow your steps? And are those steps defendable? Another issue, which was again here, you can see the different fields looking at this slightly differently, was ensuring understandable authorship. So for supervisors, this involved modeling the responsibilities of being a good author. such as engaging in critical reading, commenting, co-writing, and discussing the paper's contents, analyses, etc. And both PhD candidates and supervisors brought up different existing systems or also systems they used within their own group to help clarify the different contributions. And supervisors here are really expected to take the lead in negotiating these authorship relations with other senior researchers. This included also discussing what it meant to be an author with a PhD candidate, involving them if they wished, but them really taking the lead role, which I think is nicely exemplified by this biomedical supervisor, who's here reflecting on that she's taking more of a coaching or facilitating role here. So she knows that issues around authorship can get tedious. So she feels this is where I want to be in the lead, also to protect. I do involve my PhD candidates if they want, but this is something where I really feel I have to take over and take the sort of leading role in negotiating these sometimes tricky agreements. Another issue that was really considered crucial for supervisors and PhD candidates in the social sciences and humanities was reflexivity. And here this was really understood as critically reflecting on their own background, and also for the supervisor to involve the PhD candidates in these reflections. And they would also try to challenge the PhD candidate to reflect on the choices they make and how their role as a researcher could also influence particular choices in the design. And part of the challenge here also consisted in ensuring that PhD candidates stayed true to their research paradigm and that they were consistent in the applications of the quality criteria. And I think it's really nicely exemplified here too, where this PhD candidate is already really aware of it. And it was something actually many others in her group also recognized that she knew, just because the way that she was brought up. This person is working in archaeology. She has a particular framing or a particular way of interpreting these unique artifacts. And from time to time, having that challenged has proven to be really useful for her. And it's also something that they pay a lot of attention to in her supervisory meetings. Now, especially in the empirical fields, there was a lot of talk about aligning the research question, design, and analyses. So supervisors here urged PhD candidates to critically assess the validity of their approach, also by considering alternative designs, analytical techniques. So this could mean that when selecting a particular instrument, that the supervisors would challenge the PhD candidates to ensure its suitability for that specific subgroup, since, of course, being reliable and valid on an adult population does not necessarily mean that it's going to be useful for this research if it's involving children. One supervisor even directly asked PhD candidates whether they had confidence in their own design. And I think this is something, it's a beautiful deliberation from a PhD candidate of the natural sciences, where he recalls also that this is really something that they deliberated about a lot in the group, where they really also tried to pick the best possible fit, knowing that there are multiple ways of, in principle, answering this research question. So really critically vetting the compatibility and discussing that explicitly. Something that you can see here that many fields were particularly concerned with was drawing justified conclusions. So for supervisors, this meant that they could demonstrate this by modeling a certain epistemic modesty when presenting their work. For example, by using very straightforward titles that were descriptive for their papers and presentations, and not sort of lengthy and lofty ones that suggest that they alone know the truth about this topic. They also emphasize careful proofreading and discussing the choice of words about the design applied and the analyses conducted. Some supervisors also recounted verifying whether the conclusion was written about the main research question or the primary objective of the work. And to ensure this, some supervisors made clear agreements with the research team about what would actually be considered sufficient evidence. And I think this is also nicely captured in this little discussion from supervisors from the natural sciences about how they really reflect carefully on the kind of wording and how they also try to familiarize their PhD candidate with what kind of claims can you draw and which not, and to really see if they understood the kind of actual statistics that they applied and what could be inferred from those, and how that's also a learning process. And finally, on this side, for supervisors and PhD candidates in the biomedical and parts of the social sciences, there was a lot of talk about open science practices. They were considered key in the promotion of responsible research. And this meant supervisors actively discussed the kind of consequences of a science for society during group meetings. And it also meant that they encouraged their PhD candidates to publish their outputs openly, particularly underlying research data. And supervisors also supported practices such as pre-registration. And sometimes actually the PhD candidate brought this practice. And there were other supervisors who recounted doing the first pre-registration together. And this is also exemplified from this PhD candidate in the social sciences, that in the first project, this was actually something they really thoroughly did together. And then for the other ones, he's been working on that himself, but he did appreciate doing this practice for the first time together with his supervisor. Now, if we go a little bit more towards practices that are maybe about setting a particular atmosphere in your group and normalizing certain practices, then we also see that research data management fits well there. So for supervisors, this meant normalizing in their group that the data that's collected is actually reviewed by others in the group for accuracy and for verification. It also meant that the supervisors implemented data access policies, and that those were developed in close consultation with the PhD candidates to also ensure clarity on who can actually access which data. And some supervisors also set up data validation processes, so really systematically logging any kind of data transformations that were made to ensure that the original data could always be traced. And here also participants agreed that data privacy and data provenance were serious topics, and that during PhD meetings, supervisors would raise this and also try to reassess if the agreements that were in place in the group were actually still fit for purpose. And it was something that people, especially PhD candidates, very often noted this is important. It's also exemplified by this quote from a PhD candidate in the social sciences. It is important. I hear people talk about it all the time, but I still find it very difficult to grasp what is really good here. So she's recounting how she sort of refitted her own data management strategy many, many times. And various PhD candidates too reflected on how they had implicitly picked up on the relevance of ethical reflections through sort of overhearing discussions in their group. Supervisors here really noted that they tried to set a good example by taking the ethical high road in research. So this could also mean that you take ethical review not as a bureaucratic hurdle, but really as an opportunity to receive comments and input for reflections. And some supervisors also tried to install a climate where it was normal to talk about ethics, where it's common practice to reflect on potential challenges that participants may face or ethical consequences downstream. And I think this is nicely illustrated from this professor in biomedicine, who has worked at sort of different medical institutions and has seen different ways of treating ethical review. And she's really reflecting on the fact she always tries to make sure that there is this independent ethical review, and she tries to take really the high road and to also make it clear that in our group, we do the best possible research, and this is an essential part of it in her view. And finally, particularly among PhD candidates and supervisors in the humanities and natural sciences, the coherence of research outputs was really frequently emphasized. And here, supervisors often emphasized taking a more coaching role, so to let the PhD candidates try for themselves to establish coherence in writing, but at times also intervene with a bit of a diagnostic intervention or pinpoint to a mismatch in the structure or the flow of the text. And this was actually something where, as a supervisor in the humanities reflects on, it's not only just implicit and trying to role model, or explicit and really saying what has to be done differently. It's kind of both. And she recounts this in particular when she's co-writing articles with PhD candidates, where she also tries to think, am I practicing what I'm preaching? Is this the most coherent way I could write? And how do you really do that? How do you establish coherence in your argument, and that it somehow becomes really intertwined throughout the supervision process? Moving on to the second research question, about which kind of actions or behaviors could promote a supervisory climate that's characterized by trust and safety. What you will see here is that the heat map is indicative of how much each perspective or each party is supposed to take a leading role in this. So you will sometimes see that the color is darker for the PhD candidate, sometimes maybe equally dark for the PhD candidate and the supervisor. So if you want to instill this culture of safety and trust, something that different people from all sorts of disciplinary backgrounds emphasize is striking this kind of balance between providing thoughtful and challenging feedback, but not making decisions on behalf of the candidate. So the supervisor challenges on the one hand, supports on the other, and is really trying to balance this. And I quite like this reflection from some PhD candidates from the social sciences, where one speaker is recounting that when she started, she really wanted to get this kind of validation from her supervisor that she was on the right track. And then the second speaker actually replies that she never got that kind of feedback from a supervisor, and that her supervisor always says, no, this is your decision. And that she actually knows herself, oh, I'm not the best at making decisions. And that she learned through a bit of a painful process that her supervisor's strategy is actually very clever. She never makes a decision for her. She always forces her to take, you have to take a decision. And it's good, even though it's frustrating, which I think is something that may apply more generally here, actually. Accommodating and adapting for supervisors meant accommodating is really meant to signify this process of guiding PhD candidates through the complexities of academia. So this could also include sharing your own mistakes and setbacks, and in that way maybe role model how to deal with disappointment. Some supervisors emphasize that asking questions was something they explicitly encouraged, and they also wanted their PhD candidate to share their mistakes and uncertainties. And adapting includes the kind of willingness to change behavior in the face of feedback, including feedback they actively solicited. So this is something that this group of supervisors in biomedicine is dwelling on, where they really think it's also crucial as a supervisor to, from time to time, dare to admit that there was maybe something to that alternative vision that the PhD candidate presented. Even though we might have gone into direction A, your proposal for direction B was maybe valid after all, and acknowledging that. And really hearing, in extension to that, also actively asking for feedback, saying, okay, honestly, I know I'm not perfect, but what would be your suggestions for me? And for PhD candidates, this meant actively seeking and accepting support. So seeking support also means, being open about the fact that work doesn't have to be flawless right away. And approaching the supervisor with an honest question, letting go of the misconception that the supervisor is unapproachable. But it did mean that they were ultimately the one making the decision on how to move forward with the work. And both parties, of course, if you are a good leader or a good follower for that regard, it helps to be self-aware. And for supervisors, self-awareness primarily involved recognizing, of course, the limits of their own knowledge and expertise. Being open about this was considered crucial for trusting relationship. But self-awareness also pertained to acknowledging their personal insecurities and areas for growth. And in a way, being very conscious about the kind of role you take and the role you have in reference to your PhD candidate. So this is from a supervisor in the social sciences who tells about how he's really deeply involved with the work of his PhD candidates, and he wants them really to succeed, and how he sometimes has to balance it. There's a way in which you get very close, working together for about 4 years, but that he thinks ultimately being a responsible and self-aware person also means retaining the right amount of distance. And that it's in that way sometimes very different from writing together with your colleagues who might also be your friends. But he knows I'm always going to have this institutionalized role, so I shouldn't go for a sort of a friendship. I can be friendly, but I also have to remain and retain this professional distance. So the PhD candidates, self-awareness involved a deep understanding that a PhD trajectory is a unique learning process. There's no trajectory exactly like yours. For some, this really also opened up the space for reflecting on what do I want to get out of it. And for others, it maybe meant more that they realized the focus should be on the work, and this helped them to deal with feedback more constructively. And finally, there's the idea of instilling a culture of care. So supervisors aim to cultivate a culture of care by showing genuine interest in every PhD candidate and colleague in the group, emphasizing everyone is a worthy researcher, regardless of their cultural or economic background. This included also respecting, mental health boundaries, work-life balance, work-family strategies, cultural practices. And for some supervisors meant that they shared their work-life practices or their sort of strategies for dealing with this. And for others, it at least meant that they recognized that they had to be a little bit more patient and help a PhD candidate adjust to a new cultural setup and try to also familiarize themselves a little bit with their culture. And for PhD candidates, a culture of care is established when they feel confident that if they want to share an issue, that they can, realizing that it's still up to them, and that they have the autonomy over making that decision, but that they could confide in their supervisor or they could confide in a relevant other if something was not really going well with them. So acting with care here really involves maintaining professionalism, respecting cultural preferences and practices, but also promoting a friendly atmosphere without the expectation necessarily of forming close friendships. So when I was reflecting on these results myself, I realized that going into this project, I really had the idea that this is all going to be about the role of the supervisor. And I realized that the role of the PhD candidate can really be just as important. And I think in particular in answering that second research question became extremely evident to me that we need both parties if we want to instill a responsible supervisory climate, or to use the quote from Louisa May Alcott, who's the writer of the book Little Women, it takes two flints to make a fire. And I frankly think that fire metaphor may extend even broader. You may remember from maybe your sort of physics and chemistry classes back in high school, we need three things to make fire, right? We need something combustible, like wood. We need heat from the sun. And we need oxidizers, typically oxygen. You can also use other gases and you get the fire in very funky colors. And I think similarly, if we want to cultivate responsible research, we need these three components. We need a safe and trusting climate. We need explicit discussion about what good research means, but what also means that we need to try to do the right thing implicitly, even when no one's watching. So with that, I want to contextualize my results a little bit. There's, of course, been a tremendous amount of work into the field of leadership, which I really want to shout out for. What I noted when familiarizing myself with this body of work is that very often there too, leadership theories really depart from the particular characteristics, traits, or actions that the leader does. And I think supervision doesn't take place in a vacuum, and that this interplay is super, super important. So it might frankly be more useful there to focus on a supervisory climate. And I also want to stress the fact that this work was conducted in a Northwestern context. I conducted focus groups in Denmark and the Netherlands, which are really odd candidates in and of their own right, even within Europe. We really deeply fancy informality, but we're also tremendously difficult cultures to integrate to. We're supposed to be really flat and no hierarchy, but then I think we can all ask international colleagues who've learned the hard way that there definitely is hierarchy. The rules are just much more explicit or implicit, sorry. So I think the practices or actions to promote safety and trust could take a very different shape in different cultural settings. And with that, I look forward to your questions. If you want to read up on any of my results, you can find a link to the preprint here. Thank you very much.